So yeah, it's all working. Got it. Feel bad for the folks seeing online. I'm going to be like in and out of the screen. So I'm the executive director of the Marine Animal Response Society. As Boris mentioned, I was also a student here a long time ago. So you'll hear a little more about that. And I did 2 of my degrees here, my undergraduate degree, and then I continued on to do my graduate work. So what we're going to talk about today is probably a bit of an unorthodox view of how we are approaching whale conservation, and it's through incident response. Still science-based, but it's not quite sort of the direct science and research that people think about with these animals. Let's see if this works. Hello. There we go. Beautiful. We're figuring this out. So I actually started here at Dalhousie, and I was one of the original people doing the pilot whale research project through Hal's lab many moons ago. And then I did a lot of work with him on sperm whales off South America. And then did my graduate work looking at northern bottlenose whales, which are a beaked whale off Nova Scotia. And the work there was very much focused on the movements of bottlenose whales, where we found them out on what's called the Scotian Shelf, so out by Sable Island. And the results of that led to some of the identification of their critical habitat. So for me, that was sort of the eye-opening work to start seeing the science bleeding into conservation. And so as Boris mentioned, after that, I left Dal, after I did both my degrees. I also did a lot of consulting and ended up with World Wildlife Fund Canada here in Halifax, and I was their species conservation manager for a very long time. And most of my work focused on endangered North Atlantic right whales. And so really, this is where I really firmly flipped over into the conservation world, although very science-based. That's my key focus. And with these guys, it was trying to figure out how do we stop killing and hurting them? And who do we need to work with in order to do that? Because what you may or may not know about conservation is there's no one person who's going to solve it, no matter what they say. It is very much a collaborative effort, and it has to involve all of the players. So it isn't just science, it isn't just managers, it's also industry, it's also Indigenous partners, it's communities, it's not-for-profits, you name it, it's everyone is involved. And so for me, it very much was about the animals. And so as Boris said, I've loved whales since I was very little. My mother will tell you at the age of 10, I was just uber fascinated with these animals, yet I hadn't seen any. Except once in Marineland. I feel a little ashamed about that now. But now we have many more opportunities to see them where we should, which is out in the wild. And so for me, the other side of this issue is it's not about having enough, the numbers, because really what's enough and for who? Is it for us? Is it for them? Because I think and even for humans, which humans, who says what enough is? I'm not an enough person or by the numbers person. For me, it's very much about the health of these animals. Are the animals we have out there healthy? Do you have big fat right whales like the guy at the top? Or do you have really thin and horribly disgusting looking right whale at the bottom? That's the same species, 2 different animals. One has been significantly hurt in its life and yet is still alive. And so for me, it's very much, are they healthy? Are they having the babies they should be having? Are they able to feed? Can they move around? And it really is about for them, not for us. Although I'll tell you, you get to see them, absolutely amazing animals. But really it's their intrinsic value. They have a right to live as much as we do, and they should be able to do that free from harm. Where they can't, so right whales are probably the poster child for how much hurt and harm we can put on a species. What's the reason? Is it things that we cause? Because that's the stuff we can control, are the things that we do to these animals. I should say those are the things we should be able to control and really must control. So then the question comes down to, well, do we know what's hurting these animals? And if so, what data do we have on that? What information, what empirical information do we have to be able to say what's happening, what's hurting them? Because that is what leads us to the ability to conserve and protect them. We need the information to say that they are being hurt. We need to know what's happening to them. And then we need to use that information to make a difference. And especially for some, like right whales, we need them to recover. For right whales, there's 330 of them left on the planet. That's it. There's right whales in the Southern Ocean. There's right whales in the Pacific. But this is it for this particular species, the North Atlantic right whale. We have 336. They only exist here off of Canada and the US, the East Coast. And so this really, while that's a number, it's about trying to make them be healthy enough to be able to come back. And they're giving it their best. We just have to help them. So the thing for me is that this is really about taking the science to the conservation. We need to have that scientific information that'll help us make the case, because we have to make the case. Even when you see animals like that, we still have to fight to make the case that we're doing something to hurt them. That should be evidence enough. That animal actually is severely entangled in fishing gear. So that's why it's actually gotten really skinny, and it's gotten all covered in like little, we always call them bugs, they're cyamids and whatnot, little crustaceans that feed on their tissue. It looks horrible. They shouldn't look like that. Even the ones we term healthy here, you should go have a look at the southern right whales. They are fat and roly-poly, very few scars. They're massive, even compared to our healthy right whales up here. So the interesting thing too is, so for me, it's about that science to conservation pathway. And I'll tell you, that's not always how our government views it, sadly. It's a very different game when you come to the politics side, which I also work on that aspect as well, because conservation is largely, sadly, about politics a lot of the time. So a lot of people would ask, why? Why do we need to do this? Why is it important? I mean, other than the animals are just ridiculously fascinating and you should see them and you should experience them from a very safe distance and all that. You know, in our country, in Canada, on this coast, there's really only 2 species that our government in a sense cares about. Not that the individual humans in our government don't, but the government at large. North Atlantic right whales, like this guy here, was a dead animal. His name was Wolverine. He was 9 years old when he died. I think 9 years old. So our government really on this coast cares about right whales and belugas. We have a lot more species here. We have actually well over almost 25, almost 30 species who use our waters on the East Coast regularly. And for most of them, unlike right whales, you know, things like, let's see if this works, blue whales and northern bottlenose whales were both also listed under our Species at Risk Act. We have species like humpbacks and minkies who are currently right now under extremely high levels of mortality in both Canada and the US, largely human caused. And we have a variety of other species, delphinids like the pilot whales and dolphins, but also sperm whales. All of these other species exist in the East Coast of Canada and with regularity. It's not that they're rare, they're here all the time, some of them year round. And for most of these animals, we know really very little about them, except a few species, sperm whales and pilot whales. There's been quite a lengthy research project in the bottlenose whales, but almost all the others, we don't have anyone even studying them. We have very little information about their populations, about what's hurting them, how often they have babies. What we do know, though, from a lot of the work that I do and others, are that we are seeing them die and we're seeing them hurt. And usually it's because of human activities. And so things that we do for right whales might help them, but there's a lot of caveats that go with that we'll come to. So really, the thing too is that for these animals, everything that one species faces, pretty much they all are, and this isn't even just for cetaceans, which are the whales, dolphins, porpoises, pinnipeds, the seals, sea turtles, sharks, they're all facing the same sort of gambit of problems out in our oceans. And this is problems from our activities out there. This is problems from things like changes in their prey, the changes in the ecosystem, climate change. These animals are under a great deal of stress just to live their lives in this giant, vast ocean that most people don't even think about too much on a daily basis. And the thing is, it's not just a problem for them. So we need to care about them for their sake if they should exist, because my God, if people in the future don't actually only learn about these guys from museums and online, horrible. That is like the most horrific thought in my mind, is that if people can't actually go see these or even just know that they still are out there breathing. These are the largest animals on the planet, the blue whale, bigger than anything that has ever existed on this planet. And it's still out there right now. And if you get to see it, oh, I can still, it brings me to tears thinking about the first time I ever saw one. Sorry, I totally get off topic. But the first time I ever saw one, I can still hear the sound of when the big blow it made and the big intake. And it was pipe organ. It was beautiful, beautiful animal. So yeah, that shouldn't just exist from a skeleton or something in a museum, right? However, it also is important they exist for us. Whales, and all the marine life out there, but especially the large whales, are very important ocean architects. So these are very large animals that often swim great distances horizontally. They also dive to the depths, so they're also swimming through our oceans vertically. And the whole while, they are part of the big mixing. They're making sure the ocean is mixing. They also poop a lot. So when they poop a lot, they're also putting out a lot of nutrients. And then when they dive, they pull those nutrients down. They help feed things that are on the bottom. They're also coming up to the surface and pooping there and whatnot. And so that poop is essentially fertilizer. And so you get these great plumes of phytoplankton because they, the trees of the seas, those are enabled to be able to bloom because they have access to a lot of these nutrients. This is really important for us. It's actually really important for our planet because the ocean is the biggest sink for carbon. Phytoplankton, because of the trees, are sucking in a lot of that carbon. So our oceans are actually equally, if not more important than trees, because our planet is obviously more blue than green. And so if without this whale pump, as we term it, this is not as effective as it should be. And it's interesting because people don't often make that connection to whales. They don't think about the fact of the services that they are providing, even if it's not intentional for us, but it absolutely is for us. The mess we're making in our atmosphere, this is helping to clean it up. And if they're not there to help drive it, we've got a problem. There was a study done a few years ago by the International Monetary Fund where they estimated that one whale is worth 1,000 trees. One whale. And we aren't even protecting them from just thinking about it from that aspect. And yet our government has huge promises around climate change and addressing climate change. And we see that. What are we doing in our oceans to help make sure that that is doing what it needs to do? And it's like I said, it's the biggest driver in terms of sequestering carbon. So it's really important for us as well that they exist. Also just because they're freaking cool. So it's really important that we have data on these animals. We have data on the species themselves. We have data on the impacts to them, the threats. Number one, it's important because of the species themselves, for their own protection, their own recovery, their conservation. Like I said, a lot of these species are under the same threats. A lot of them have low populations. They have low reproductive rates. And so we need to have a better handle on how we need to help them. Many of them are at risk in Canada too. We also, Canada has great things written on paper. They've made lots of commitments internationally and nationally under things like the UN about ocean health, biodiversity, protection of all of that. How do they measure that? How do we know that we're succeeding if we aren't keeping track of some of this information? And the other side of this is we also, as a country and as a planet, have made, again, things on paper about industry sustainability, making sure our activities aren't doing harm to things that they're not supposed to be harming. There's a lot of commitments through the UN. There's a lot of commitments through our own national legislation about the industries being sustainable, whether it's fishing, shipping, aquaculture, everything. So if we aren't figuring out what harm it's having, how do we know if they are sustainable? A lot of industries claim to be sustainable. Where's the data that shows that? The other really important thing, and this is probably the biggest political player in most of the whale conservation work happening right now in Canada, is about trade and market access. So for example, the US has a Marine Mammal Protection Act. We don't have anything comparable, but they have one. And under it, they are now implementing what's called a bycatch rule. It basically says that any country who wants to import their seafood into the US has to demonstrate that those industries, that the fish and whatnot didn't come from a fishery that harmed marine mammals. Not just cetaceans, marine mammals means it includes pinnipeds. And probably the number one animal we see that dies on our coasts are seals. Not that it's all because of industry issues, but so the big thing is Canada has to show what harm our fisheries, all the different fisheries are having in order to be able to import seafood into the US. Canada exports about 80% of its seafood to the US. This is a huge driver in even thinking about and trying to consider the conservation of these animals. Right now, Canada has put in information to the US saying, here's what we know about bycatch in our fisheries. I'll tell you, it doesn't include any of the information we have, which is very interesting. So huge political player and reason why they're talking even about whales right now. So the big thing is that really for all those species that I showed you and talked about, for most of them, they're really hard to study or they're not being studied. It's not easily done. There's not a lot of funding in Canada to study whales outside of some pockets of species. There's not a lot of interest to support. I mean, we have interest, but in terms of the funding streams, it's for very few species. And so the thing is, we don't have a lot of information for almost every other animal in our oceans, except for in our ocean in Canada, except for a few. And so we need to get that data somewhere, and that's where Mars has come in. So as Boris mentioned, I founded Mars when I was probably between my undergrad and my graduate degree. We would get calls to Hal's lab that there was a whale dead on a beach or there's one in trouble somewhere. Not what the Whitehead lab does. That's totally fine. But I probably, as a naive undergrad or maybe just a really passionate Nova Scotian, thought, well, why aren't we keeping track of this information? That is information on species that nobody's studying. We were getting calls about pygmy sperm whales and dolphins of all kinds and minke whales and humpbacks, and who was even keeping track of when those calls were and when those things were happening? Because fisheries and oceans in Canada at the time was not either. So that's the other thing, is that for the most part, our federal government, which is for oceans, it's through DFO, Fisheries and Oceans, they're the ones technically responsible to make sure that these animals are safe. They're responsible to make sure that the Species at Risk Act is implemented to help the animals that are at risk. But nobody was really even keeping track of the data. And so, again, I probably, as an extremely naive undergraduate student, and Hal will tell you it's probably the reason my master's took longer than it should have, I helped found MARS. And there was an organization that existed before it. It was called the Nova Scotia Stranding Network. It operated for a few years in the early 90s. It went defunct. The fellow who ran it passed away, so it kind of stopped. A few other grad students had picked it up from time to time, but then they left. So I picked it up, the Nova Scotia Stranding Network, and we've morphed it into MARS, the Marine Animal Response Society. And so everyone, for the most part, thinks of us as a response organization. We do go out and respond to dead animals and live animals that are in trouble, but it actually is a conservation organization. It's rooted in doing it, that kind of response, but with a purpose. Because I'll tell you, dead animals are extremely fascinating. I don't like to see them dead, but oh man, if you get to do a necropsy on one, which is an autopsy, it is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And we do them on small ones right up to like 83-foot blue whales. It's one of the coolest experiences, though very sad. But I'll tell you, I've done hundreds. So for me, it's about the scientific information we can get from it to help save them. It's about helping them tell their stories so we can help save them. So we are fundamentally a conservation organization at heart. We're very small. I always say we're small but mighty. There's technically at the moment only probably about equivalent of two full-time people with MARS. I'm one of them. Everyone else are on-call hotline operators, of which one of Boris's students is our hotline operator, and we have on-call responders as well. We just don't have the funding to have huge infrastructure and lots of people. But we do an awful lot of work, and especially in the last few years. We're also a Canadian charity. Whenever things about donating, you can donate to MARS. So we operate, though, not just in Nova Scotia, we're throughout the entire maritime provinces, and we deal with a whole range of types of incidents. Dead things on beaches or floating, live things that are in trouble at sea or on beaches, trapped in something, everything from all the cetaceans, but also your pinnipeds. We also deal with sharks, which are happening more and more. And we also assist with sea turtles where our colleagues with the Sea Turtle Network need assistance. We do this for the little guys. And again, like I said, we also do this for the big guys, everything from humpbacks and blue whales. We also deal with mass strandings, which happen here quite a bit as well. We absolutely do not do this alone. We're small, like I said, but mighty, but we can't do everything. We work with colleagues like the Campobello Whale Rescue Team to deal with disentanglement of large animals. We also work incredibly closely with what's called the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. It's the virtual network of veterinarians, wildlife pathologists across the country, and ours are based at the Atlantic Vet College. We actually have an embarrassment of riches. There's 3 of them there. Including one who's retired, but he's not really retired, which is fabulous. We actually probably have more wildlife pathologists, the people who actually do the necropsies and do all the diagnostics themselves to figure out what happened to these animals. It's amazing that we actually have access to them because they are super keen about this. So we deal with the whole range of incidents throughout the entire maritime provinces. We also have lots of volunteers. And so that's one of the other things that especially students at universities have often signed up as volunteers. We have them throughout the Maritimes. People interested, you can check out our website and find out. And the thing again is why we do it. Why is it important that we do this work? Fundamentally, like I said, it's about conservation, which means the work that we're doing is primarily research and monitoring. Response is the way we do it, but it is about research and monitoring, both for the species themselves. Like I said, this is a wealth of biological information. The information you can get from a dead animal is endless, but it is also really important because it is helping us identify what hurts them, which means we can help figure out what needs to be done to help save them. The other piece is that when mitigation measures are put in place, people put in, moving shipping lanes, closing areas for fishing, we should then see fewer animals die by vessels getting hit by vessels or entangled in fishing gear. So this is really one of the core monitoring tools to see if all these investments our government and whatnot are making is working, which ultimately is what we want to see. We want to see that it's working. We just have to be looking to see if it's working. So in terms of the information of what we get, so every year we get about 400 to 600 calls about marine animals in the maritime provinces. We also have colleagues in Quebec, and we also have colleagues in Newfoundland as well, and they get probably similar numbers. So on every year we're probably getting 1,000 to 1,500 reports of marine animals, and that's the whole gamut of all the species. So a few years ago, we were collectively talking about the species that we were seeing throughout Eastern Canada. And the question really was, well, what do we know? We hadn't really ever put all the information together. There have been some papers written. We had a student years ago here at Dal who took some of our information and wrote up about what we see here. And they've done it in Quebec and Newfoundland as well. But we had never put all that information in one spot to kind of get a feel for, well, what do we see? And do we know anything about what happens to them? And so Mars decided to do that a few years ago, which was an interesting undertaking. But first, so incident response, we get calls, we run hotlines. So that's essentially how we get this information. Mars runs a toll-free hotline here for the Maritimes. In Quebec, it's an organization called GREM, and in Newfoundland, it's run through the Whale Release and Strandings Group. Data comes from everybody. This is people from the public, it's industry on boats, it's people on planes, it's people doing surveys. It could be anyone who's contacting us to say, I see something, live or dead. The incidents generally, as much as we can and as much as we have funding for, we document everything as best as we can. Sometimes they're further investigated. Sometimes that means it's doing a full necropsy. We collect an animal and you take it apart outside to in. And sometimes it's just doing some bare bones, or when a live animal happens, it's about actively trying to go out and see what we can do. You should note too, you'll note our name says response, not rescue. It's because not every animal can be saved, or should. Sometimes they are too far gone. So we try to help them in whatever way we can. So the real two sort of key reasons that we generally exist from this point of view, number one is to keep people and animals safe and help animals where we can. The thing we've noticed that if we don't exist, people in our public will go try to help a live animal. They do this for all wildlife. It's just an extreme, wonderful passion that people have. It is incredibly dangerous. People look at a whale on a beach and they kind of go, oh, you can't really do anything. You should see them move. Like when they're stressed, like we would be, they're flailing, they're moving around. Even the seals, turtle, shark, these animals are still wild. We always talk about the Disneyfication of animals. They're not Disney animals. These are wild animals, and they carry diseases, and they have teeth. Like, seriously, some of them, most of them have teeth. So number one is about keeping people safe. And it's also about doing what's right for the animal when they're alive and in trouble, because it isn't always the things people think. Number one thing people do when there's a dolphin on a beach is they grab it by the tail and they start dragging it into the water. That is the worst place you can pull an animal from, a whale, because you're essentially pulling it from the smallest point on its body. You're pulling the entire mass of an animal from that little tiny. I always think about people, tell people, if you're think about dealing with a wild animal or a dolphin, like as if you're dealing with a small child, you don't pull by the arms, you don't haul on its head, because it's just really dangerous and you can do some bad damage. Number two reason really is about collecting this very important research and monitoring data. Every incident is an opportunity for getting something. And even if it's just knowing that that species happened and it was that animal right there, that's a data point. So like I said, we at that point then gathered all the data for the entire east coast of Canada just for cetaceans, and from 2004 to 2019. So we did basically a 15-year retrospective. This is really complicated. It's harder than you think because the different networks collect data differently. Can't emphasize enough how important it is to work with colleagues to figure out how to collectively collect the data the same. We don't. So there was a lot of variation. It took an awful lot of time just to do the quality control of the data. And in the end, it limited a bit of what we could do because we could only look at sort of the who, what, where, and when. There was a lot of other information that just wasn't collected necessarily by whichever group. And sometimes it was our own. So for us, our report we put out was called Beyond the Numbers. It looked at trends in the species, the timing, the locations of these animals. And again, these were just reported incidents. So that's another very important point. It's just the information and the animals that are called into us. We know that there are way more animals out there that are getting hurt or are dead because of the activities in the ocean or even natural causes. We only know about them if someone calls us. So for example, things like right whales, 86% of living right whales have scars from being entangled in fishing gear. We don't see 86% dead on a beach, thank God, but we know that that means that they're encountering it, either getting out of it on their own or someone else helps them out of it. But that's much higher than you would see in the data that we have, because animals do live after some of these, and they're not reported. And sometimes they're just not even detected. No one even saw that whale swim by with that gear. That happens all the time. So these are just reported incidents. The other thing is, what we wanted to be able to have a look at is what did we find when we looked at the animals? This was really tricky because it wasn't always recorded, which is a shame. And investigations weren't always done. We still used the data as best we could to look at two metrics about impacts to cetaceans. So we looked at the cause of death. So when it was a dead animal, did someone look to see what happened to it? Did we figure something out? The other one was if there were any signs of human interactions. And so this involves both those dead animals, but also live animals. So when someone's dealing with a live animal, do they see scars? Do they see gear on it? You know, obviously a live entangled swimming animal, human interaction, it's filled with fishing gear, for example, or some other type of gear. Not all gear in the ocean is fishing. Should also clarify that. And so we tried to, as best as we could, see what data existed from the entire east coast of Canada to have a look at this. The other thing I should point out there is, because I kind of touched on it, it wasn't for the point of the pointing blame. So we are very much a, like I said, conservation organization, but we work with everyone. And it is not about figuring out who did it. I don't need to know it was your gear or your gear. We need to know what it was so that we can figure out what to do about it. So it's very much, again, a collaborative effort, which is why we work very closely with our fishing industries, with the other mariners on the water, because we need them to tell us when these things happen. We often, when it is gear on an animal, we also need them to help us figure out what it is. I am not a fishing gear expert by any stretch of the imagination. I have done a lot of fishing, but not to the extent that I can discern gear from here to there, but they can. So they're very critical parts of this whole process. The other thing too is that when looking at signs of human interaction, it's very tricky if you only look at the outside of the animal. So we see things like fishing gear and scars often because you can look at the outside of the animal. Things like vessel strikes, ingestion of plastics, impacts from pollution, including noise pollution, you don't see it from the outside usually. You have to open the animal up. So we have an incredible biased data set if you're just looking at a photo that someone sent and going, oh, there's signs of it was entangled. But do you know if there's anything else? Or even just saying there's no signs of anything. So therefore, no human interaction. Is that true? If you didn't look inside? So our motto, which we tout everywhere, is if you don't look, we don't know. If you don't look at all, even the outside, you just don't know. But if you don't look internal and external, we have very biased information. And so for us, the important thing is you have to look. And so we spend an awful lot of time trying to fight to be able to do these necropsies on dead animals. It isn't usually successful unless there's something we can pick up on our own. But when they're big animals, we need excavators and lots of people, and that takes a lot of money, which isn't always available for anything other than right whales here. So quickly, I just want to show you what we did find, though, when we pulled all this information together. So over the last 15 years, we've had over 3,100 incidents that involve just cetaceans, so your whales, dolphins, porpoises. Predominantly, those were dead animals, so almost 70% were actually just carcasses, either on beaches or floating, and the live animals were around 30%. And the other thing you can see in this, as is looking just very loosely at this trend map, it's going up. So it starts out fairly, even, and then but for the last 5-6 years, both live and dead are trending upwards, and especially the dead, which is bad from the point of view of these animals. But however, from a person who runs a very small, Canadian charitable organization that does response, it's terrifying because we are very underfunded, understaffed, and stretched thin already. If this is going up, we have even more work to be doing, and that's very tricky. Most of the incidents were odontocetes, so we had about 56% of the incidents were our toothed animals, so dolphins, sperm whales, things like that. And the rest were mysticetes, so your baleen whales, the ones with the hairy fringe that filter feed in the ocean. We also had some that were unidentified. Pretty much, if we can't figure out what they are, they're usually kind of a pile of mush, and you're not going to figure it out unless you do genetics. So in terms of the range of species, we had over 25 different species that were documented through all of these cases throughout Eastern Canada, 10 of which are considered at risk in Canada. And so when I use the word at risk, you'll notice I'm not saying SARA listed species. These are species that are listed under SARA, the Species at Risk Act. There are also species that are considered at risk by their assessment by CSIWIC, which is the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. It's an independent body that does all of the assessments of species. Because in my mind, we can go all into the politics of how SARA works, not much fun, although I'll skip that. The species get listed under SARA, they don't all get listed. Sometimes they can say, well, we're not going to put it under that legislation because we should be able to protect it elsewhere. Which means that CSIWIC assessment, so for example, harbor porpoises, they're a threatened species, they're threatened. The experts have said they're threatened. Just because they're not listed under the federal law, because they're supposed to be protected elsewhere, doesn't necessarily mean they're no longer at risk. They absolutely are. And this is really important when it comes to some of the fish species and the sharks as well. Lots of them never get listed under federal legislation for all kinds of reasons, usually politics, but they are still endangered fish. They're still at-risk species. So that's my little rant for species at risk. It drives me bonkers. In terms of the species we have seen in all of these 3,100 plus incidents, there are 4 that make up 60% of them: harbor porpoises, belugas, humpbacks, and minkies. over 2/3 of all the incidents we see involve those 4 species, which is crazy. And except for belugas, which have some money behind them because they're a species important to our government, the rest don't. So most of those go uninvestigated. And I highlighted at the bottom, right whales are only 2% of all the species that we deal with, which again, they're rare. That's not unexpected, but that's where the bulk of the money is, to sort of save whales and look at whale health, which absolutely, right whales need the infusion of support. But we certainly don't want humpbacks and minkies to end up in that case, that situation, because we weren't paying attention. The other thing to point out is that 44% of the incidents involved at least one of these at-risk species, these 10 species. So one, it's a serious problem. We're having a lot of these animals that are being turned up dead or alive and in trouble. Two, it's one heck of a source of information about them, if you can study them. In terms of where we saw them, all over. So the different colored dots represent the different families. So dolphin family, sperm whale family, baleen whale family. But you can basically see it's everywhere throughout Eastern Canada. These are all opportunistic. So this is just people randomly having seen something and called it in. There are some gaps. So you'll see some significant gaps in places like in the middle of the Gulf of St. Lawrence or off parts of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. This might be because there's no incidents occurring there. It mostly is likely because we just don't have eyes there. So with these kind of incidents, we have lots of acoustic work being done on cetaceans. Dead animals don't make sounds. So we have significant gaps in where we're looking as well. But it is pretty much everywhere. In terms of the type of incidents, and again, I should have warned you at the beginning, we talk about live and dead animals. There's dead animals in this, you're going to see them, which is important. It's important to sort of see what happens to them. Most of the incidents are carcasses, what I mentioned at the beginning. So 70% are just a dead animal that's found floating or on a beach. But we do have 15% that are live and entangled in something, or 7% that end up live stranded. Well, the expertise that Mars actually has in the entire country is that we deal with live stranded whales. That's really our expertise in the realm of all the response. We do lots of other pieces, but our expertise is really around how you deal with a 15-foot whale that suddenly is on a beach and how do we rescue that animal. We actually have medic courses. We usually do one through dams. Actually, sometime in the fall, we usually run one to show you how we do it, because we have a huge 15-foot pilot whale we fill with water. She's amazing. And so you get to see how it works. But sorry, back to the important things here. A lot of these are carcasses, and I'll tell you, most of those carcasses were not examined. So we end up with another situation. If we don't look, we don't know. So we don't know what happened to those animals. We don't know how they were hurt or how they died. And so again, we're missing really valuable sources of information. The other thing that this adds complication to is that at least the finger pointing. You get a dead giant whale in the middle of the Bay of Fundy. Immediately someone says, oh, it's probably because of the wind, the turbines. Oh, it's because of the fishing activities. Oh, it's because of the ships. All I can say is we don't know, because we don't have the means to go look and fully look, not just look on the outside and go, oh, there's no signs. Well, therefore, fishing is off the hook kind of a thing. If we don't look, we don't know. And you end up with people pointing fingers at each other, and that does no one any good. Absolutely no good. So if we could maximize the things that we look at, live and dead, especially dead, we actually might be able to hone in on really where the problems are and when and for what species. And that's how you figure out what to do, and who to do it with is the biggest thing. So really, like I said, the goal is to have as many people involved in these situations to be able to figure out what to do to help these animals. But I will clarify, but that's not to say that people in a room don't all have different perspectives. I come in with a very different perspective from someone who's fishing and needs to feed their family to someone who's a government official who needs to implement laws or policies. Just because they have different opinions doesn't make it makes it complicated, but it doesn't make it, you don't exclude anyone, because their opinion about what's happening is very relevant to what needs to be done. It's not easy. It certainly is one of the most biggest challenges for conservation, is how you deal with the different personalities and the different ways that they're looking at an issue. But they have to all be in that room, because conservation and the saving them comes from everyone being together. Okay, one of the other key issues was really around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So the Gulf of St. Lawrence is the body of water that sits between Newfoundland, Quebec, PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So that internal big giant sea in there. There was a lot of interest in what the heck was going on in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, because we suddenly had right whales who had been around the southern part of Nova Scotia for years move up into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's been figured out they moved there because their prey was junk, essentially, in their usual areas, and so they moved, likely because of climate change. So we have this very large, highly critically endangered species moving into one of the busiest areas for human activity that exists in Canada. busiest shipways that go into Quebec and into Ontario, huge amounts of fishing, lots of ferries, lots of pleasure crafts in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And so everyone suddenly, in 2017 and 2019, we had 2 very large mass die-offs of right whales. In total, there was 21 animals that died between those 2 years. What people don't like to talk about is that in 2015, we actually had 3. We couldn't get any money to look at them in 2015, really, except for one of them. And that was after a while. And I'll tell you, 2017, when the first whale started dying, which we helped lead the response to all of these very large dead floating whales, it took until whale number 6 to convince our government they should bring them ashore so we could do necropsies. And this is a highly critically endangered species, protected under federal law. We already know that they're mostly dying because of vessel strikes and entanglements. We have recovery strategies and action plans, which clearly say we have to study them when they're dead. I know, I helped write them. I'm on the committee that does that. Not that that's why it was in there. It's important to do. But it took forever. I think I was on the phone, various calls, and probably accumulated almost 150 hours on phone calls and Zoom call and everything else to try to convince our government they need to bring them in to look at them. We had experts from the US and around the world also on those calls saying, well, you have to do the necropsies. We need to know what was happening, especially when suddenly, 6, 7, 8 of them are dying all of a sudden. What happened? Did a boat run through a giant group? Did some disease? Was it something they ate? We needed to know. You absolutely have to know. And especially because it was continuing. So it had to keep, we had to figure it out. But it took forever, even to the extent that with one fellow person in our federal government said, well, why can't you get information when they're floating? Shouldn't you be able to figure out what happened to them? So we actually had to go out on a boat through Coast Guard, which was very lovely, and go out, and we were looking for one whale, tripped across another new dead right whale, and we actually put one of our vets on top of it to try to collect some samples. Basically, we had to prove you can't do a necropsy at sea. Highly dangerous. Even now, I'm like, oh my God, why did we do that? But we had to basically prove what you couldn't do, which was obnoxious, let's put it that way, because everyone knows you need the animal accessible. You have to be safe while you're doing it, and you have to be done with the right people. You can't do a necropsy at sea, and you can't really get enough samples to show what happened to it just by doing a few things at sea. Anyway, they stopped doing that. 2019, when it unfortunately reoccurred, everything was much smoother. They immediately knew we need to get the animals in. They were almost bringing them in too fast for us to get to the places they were bringing them. However, so everyone very much went Gulf of St. Lawrence, problem for right whales. What they were ignoring is that these other colored dots are mostly not right whales. So almost all of the others, so 525 incidents in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, this is about 50% of all the missed-to-seed events we even have on the East Coast are occurring in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Most of them, minkies, humpbacks, fin whales. Most of them, no necropsy whatsoever. So this is a bit of a problem. 83% or so of all the animals that happen in the Gulf are these 3 species, and we have very little information on what happened to them. And I mean, the other side of this is, and the uptick was because right whales were going to the Gulf, dying, and they're endangered. And frankly, the government kind of got caught with their pants down, essentially. The species of right whales have been protected in Canada under federal law since the act came in 2002. They have been known to be endangered since the 80s. We knew what was killing them. Very little action was happening until all of a sudden, oh my God, what's going on with all these dead animals? We should have been doing stuff well before then. We've been fighting to do stuff well before then, including with industry researchers. Lots of people have been trying to do stuff. It wasn't happening. So the key thing is we don't actually know what's happening to all these other animals. In terms of what we did see, 73% again were carcasses. Carcasses are kind of the main thing here. We also had live entanglements, and as well as some that were deemed injured or sick. So for example, this is a fin whale that was floating out to sea. The interesting thing too is, so in 2017, when we finally got all these right whales coming ashore, this relates to, so fin whales are listed under SARA, they're considered special concern. Not this guy, but another one. During the right whales, we did 3 right whales in 3 days, which is almost unheard of for a whale that's about 60 feet long. During the end of that, we actually got a call to our hotline saying that there was a fin whale, a fairly fresh one, similar to this one, that was floating also out off PEI, which is where we were doing the necropsies. And we said, look, we're all dirty. Let's just bring it here. Let's just do the fin whale as well, especially because it's listed under SARA. We were told it's not that listed. So they wouldn't bring it in. And we had 20, 30 people. We had probably 5 of the best people who've done whale necropsies on the planet there with us to help, including several from the US. And it wasn't that listed, because it was only special concern. It wasn't endangered, it wasn't threatened. But the definition of special concern is we better be paying attention, because that animal could quickly go the wrong way. And the only way we're going to know what's happening to it is if we actually look. So yeah, it was shocking to say the least, because there was no interest in bringing that fin whale in. And yet we were there, we were more than willing, and we were the ones doing the necropsies, and we're exhausted. So it's, anyway, it just shows you the, it's just slight, those little things that just irk you. So the one thing I want to highlight is why we don't have the information on those animals. So like I said, 525 reported incidents. We had 384, those were carcasses. So I'm just going to double check the time. Okay. Of those, 182 were floating. There's your problem. Most of them were not ashore. So we couldn't even look at them because they're just floating carcasses out to sea. We don't have boats. We've tried to get them. We never get the funding for all this stuff. We don't get the funding to even go out to look at them. But 182 were floating. Want to know how many were necropsied? Anyone got a guess? 14. Want to know how many were right whales? 13. One minke was brought ashore in PEI by a fisherman who brought it into the vets who were there. That's it. So in terms of baleen whale conservation in the Gulf, we are crap in the bed. I'll tell you that right now. We are missing so much opportunity to study these animals. And we know that the Gulf is filled with these whales. We have lots of information from the aerial surveys and the acoustics saying these whales use this area quite heavily. So it's just not happening. In terms of cause of death, like I said, the data wasn't great because not everyone reported it, not everyone looked, but of just the dead animals, what we saw is that only 6%, there were only 6% of all the dead animals where we had a cause of death that was either obvious, an animal that was completely, caught in something or wrapped in gear, or where necropsy was done. That's it. And of those, 50% of right whales were necropsied. For all the other species combined, less than 10% of the animals were necropsied. So the focus was on making sure right whales were necropsied, which is important, but it doesn't tell you much. Now, of the animals that were actually necropsied, what we found really is that the causes of death were entanglements, disease or emaciation, or vessel strikes. Not surprising, given what we know about what's happening there and what happens to these animals. In terms of the human interaction side of things, so this is actually looking again at the live and so all those dead animals, but also throwing in the live animals and what do we see about them. So that's the whole set of data, the 3,100 plus. In most of the cases, 49%, the blue chunk there, we don't even know if anyone looked. So there's 50% of the data we immediately couldn't even really do anything with because there's no indication if someone had even looked for a human interaction. So we couldn't. We knew that in 28% of the cases, someone had looked and said, nope, there's no human interaction there. But in 23%, there was a note saying, yes, there's human interaction. This is really tricky because you've got 50% where we have no clue if anyone even looked, but even in the proportion that someone has said, nope, there's no human interaction observed, did they look inside too? We don't know. That's not in the data. It doesn't say if it was just they looked at a picture and went, no gear, which is often what people will do. We immediately get lots of photos where people go, there's no gear on the animal. Gear also doesn't just say that's entangled, but there's scars, there's other wounds that you have to be trained to see. So it's the data is really messy and it's hard to pull the stuff out. But where we did have human interaction noted, no surprise, fishing gear was sort of the main culprit. There was other entangling gear that just didn't have an origin. There's lots of other activities out there besides fishing that use gear and things. And then of course, vessel strikes. So clearly humans are having an impact on these animals. Even with really crappy data, it's very clear to see. But there's two main issues that come in interpreting these data. So for one, like I said, we only looked at, there were 6% of animals where a cause of death was determined and an awful lot of carcasses that don't get looked at all. So we really need to look at the dead animals in more detail. The other thing too, is that we do know for a fact that some of these animals survive their human interactions. They have scars, they have old scars that they've been carrying on their bodies. So the question really is, what is that doing to them? What does it do to their health? What does it do to their reproductive potential? So this is what we term sublethal health-related impacts. It's something not a lot of people talk about, but I'll tell you, it's in the Species at Risk Act. Our Species at Risk Act says you cannot harm, harass, disturb, or kill. Harm, harass, disturb. All of those things hurt animals. So harm is part of our legislation. They just don't talk about it. So for a data-rich species like right whales, we have some information on anthropogenic mortality. It should be zero. We know for a fact, like for them to recover, you have to have no deaths. We have not hit zero. And I don't know. Last time was we had zero. We also know that right whales have reduced reproductive potential. They are not having babies like they should. They have females who are breeding age and breeding sort of quality that do not ever have babies. They don't know why. These factors lead into their potential to recover. You have to know the deaths and what's that happening. You need to minimize that and you need them to maximize having babies. One of the main reasons they think they have reduced reproductive success for right whales is because of sublethal harm from human activities. So the things that hurt them, but don't kill them, which makes sense. And that could be anything. Impacts from gear on them, being hit by a boat that didn't actually kill them, but it did injure them, things like noise pollution, all kinds of things cause stress to these animals, which stresses the mothers, and it can stress the fathers too. So that's a data-rich species. For a data-poor one, everything's a question mark. We don't even know how many there are. We don't necessarily know how many are dying or why. We don't know anything about their babies and their reproductive success. And so it really is a giant question mark as to, well, can they recover? How do you know if it can recover if you don't even know anything about it? And so the biggest thing for us is that we've been really pushing that you can't just address the mortalities alone. We have to start addressing health. Because, I mean, mortalities are part of health, but you need to know more. We need to know about if they're healthy enough, are they robust enough, can they be resilient enough? Because right whales weren't. Right whales, there was a massive catastrophe when they switched locations, and it led to the largest die-offs we've ever seen for those species outside of the days of whaling with those two events. And so we have a major problem because we are not managing for health. We are just, and what we sort of say even with right whales is we could manage them to extinction if we don't deal with their health. So this is partly why MARS, a program that we've started this last year, is called the Cetacean Health Investigation Program. We want to actually study the health of these animals in a broader context. And this is really a program that's going to help us better understand their overall health, which includes those lethal and sublethal impacts through a full suite of human activities. So we don't even just want the entanglements and the vessel strikes. We need to know about the noise. We need to know about ingestion of plastics. A few years ago, we pulled 330 pounds of various gear and fishing gear out of the stomach of a sperm whale. It was the most shock. I've dealt with all those right whales. It was the most shocking thing I've ever done with a dead animal. It was horrible. I have it in a freezer. We still haven't had the time or the money to pull it apart to see what it was, or even if we could figure out where it was from. But that sperm whale was alive, stranded ashore, days later, then died. And that's what we found. It was awful. It was awful. So we really need to understand the full scope of these impacts. We're doing this with a number of folks, including the vets at the Atlantic Vet College and this Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. The point really is to understand their health and to know how our human activities are hurting them. So what is happening? What does it do to them? And the actual impact, not just that it was there or not, the impact. What do we know about how that might hurt the animal down the road? We have a lot of people who are doing great work with acoustics. Wonderful, tells us presence, absence, sometimes can tell you if they're feeding and all that stuff. Really important, but it doesn't tell you the condition of the animal necessarily. And that's one of the things we need to get to. So one of the key things we're investing in is people. We are trying to build up the people who can help us do these kinds of necropsies. We don't always have access to our wildlife pathologists. They frankly deal with all the wildlife. You can go there on a day and there's a dead deer, there's a bear, I have moose heads that need to go over. They do all of it. So we don't always have them. They're very busy people. But we have been building a response technician program. We got some initial seed money, then it went away from the federal government, but we're still trying to make sure that we can make this happen. And you guys are getting a sneak peek because the other thing we're doing is investing in key infrastructure. And so Mars is actually building the first necropsy space for marine animals here in Nova Scotia. It's really cool. Sorry, I was looking, I'm like, oh my God, look what we're doing. It's so funny because we don't even have an office. We work at home, but we're building this because we need to be able to have a safe space to do this work, and it has to be sterile and it has to be done really well. We are building this on a piece of land that's been given to us by Hope for Wildlife. People may have heard of her. She's amazing. She is helping us get this done. We had funding from the federal government to start it. We're still trying to raise money to finish it. But the key thing too is it's not only for us to be able to do this incredible work and bring these animals into this safe environment to do it. It is also about making sure that we have a really awesome place to have opportunities for students as well. We usually bring animals here to Dow for the various classes for marine mammals and sharks. There's no facility here to do that per se. It's not sort of the most sterile and safe place to do. But that's what we're really wanting to explore now is how we can work with our local universities and researchers to make sure that we are giving those opportunities to students as well. So I'm hoping to be able to talk to folks at Dow and St. Mary's and whatnot to see how we can actually make best use of this space, given that we're going to have it. She's going to have some bells and whistles in there, including a huge freezer if we can get the money for it. So that's really what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I mean, the biggest thing really is, and I think the moral of the whole story is we actually want to prevent catastrophes rather than just react to them. You know, we want the animals, usually looking at things like health is the better indicator than looking and waiting for the bodies to wash up on the beach. We can actually monitor health. You can actually start things and mitigate things early, but we have to be doing that. And it's really sucks to go deal with, 9, 10, 12, 20 dead right whales or any species over and over and over again. I'll tell you, in 2019, when it happened again, 2017, we were upset when it was going on with the right whales. 2019, we were mad because it was still going on. And that's crazy. And they've done tons of things since. It really kickstarted our government to do and our industries to do lots of stuff for mitigation because we looked at those dead animals and had the information. So that's the key thing. And really, it doesn't really matter why you're at the table in terms of, is it conservation? Is it something else? We just care that they make sure our ecosystem runs. But really, if we're not monitoring, we're actually going to miss the chance, when the canary dies in the coal mine, because we won't even be looking at the cage. We're like looking over here and we haven't even paid attention to what's going on. So yeah. And I'll leave it with that. And I have my email. You guys can find me. We have a website. But yeah, please check us out. And that's it. Any questions?